So I'll be wearing cans today. Um, all right, I posted the second homework. This homework is going to use the same concepts that we had talked about and that you had applied on the first homework, and we're going to be using those welfare analysis ideas for analyzing um, externality correction in the first problem. We're going to think about how to implement a tax so as to adjust the quantity and align the quantity with what the efficient level was. Um, and then you're going to compare the gains in that scenario, like the total social gains in that scenario relative to the previous unregulated market scenario. That's the first one. And then the second one deals with a different way of approaching externalities, or a different way of thinking about externalities, which comes from the insights of Ronald Coase, who observed back in 1960. He observed that externalities are reciprocal. The word he used for externalities were that they were reciprocal, meaning that they necessarily required two parties, at least two parties, to be involved in some way. And if you only had one, if you had one party just doing something on their own, there's no social problem. It's only when you have someone else in close proximity to them who's there to be on the receiving end of those effects. It's only in that scenario where there's some kind of social problem and there needs to be some way to coordinate the activities. So Coase has a stylized example to kind of illustrate that point, looking at the case of a wheat farmer and a cattle rancher, and then some other kind of interesting real life examples of where these sorts of conflicts came in. It's these externalities conflicts where one person's activity has an effect on somebody else. So you'll get a chance to work through a problem that I wrote a couple days ago, which has to do with that Coase article. I do want to do just a little bit of recap, just to hammer home some of the concepts that we talked about. So, okay, we talked about the last class that the supply curve, or the private marginal cost curve, does not capture everything that we might be interested in. It only captures the individual costs to the producers, like the actual material and labor and energy costs to them. It doesn't take into account the fact that in the process of undertaking those activities, they might have a negative effect on somebody else, or they might produce some offsetting damages on somebody else. And we talked about how the way that we incorporate that into the analysis is by mapping out what those external costs look like. And so that's our marginal external cost curve that we have here on the left, the red line. We map those out. We specify the level of marginal external cost at each unit of production. And then we essentially just stack that on top of the marginal private cost curve. It's just a vertical sum of those two curves. This is kind of the welfare analysis that we had done last time. Recall that we had total benefits at QM. We were looking at QM, which is the quantity that would result in an unregulated market. We saw that the total benefits under that regime of sort of market equilibrium production, that would result in total benefits of that production equal to that trapezoid, A plus B plus C plus D plus E. We saw that the total private costs there were going to be equal to C plus D, so that's going to be the area underneath the entire supply curve up to QM. And then the external costs, those are represented by the areas between the social marginal cost and the private marginal cost curve. So that's this entire parallelogram. This entire parallelogram, the area of that represents the total external costs associated with QM units of production. So after we've accounted for all that, we've noted whether each of those areas are benefits or costs. Some of them some of those areas represent both benefits and costs, which cancel out. When the dust settles and we've canceled out all the offsetting terms, we end up with total net social benefits equal to A minus F. That's the net gains to society as a whole as a result of producing QM. And then we ask ourselves, can we do better than that? Are we able to, because we know that there's some harmful effects, are we able to choose a different quantity which could actually produce better overall outcomes in society? And so that was the case of Q star, where we saw that if we reduce our production a little bit from QM to Q star, we end up noticing that we can do better. We notice that the total benefits of that quantity are A plus B plus C. A plus B plus C, that's the total benefits of Q star. The total costs of Q star, the total private costs of Q star are area C. And it stops at Q star because we're not producing the units between Q star and QM any longer. We've cut back from there. And then just as before, the total external costs are the area between the social marginal cost curve and the private marginal cost curve up to Q star, because we're only producing Q star at this point. Okay, and then once we, again, we cancel out all the offsetting terms, the dust settles, and we notice that we have the total net gains to society are A, which is larger than A minus F. So we've improved matters by curtailing production from QM back to Q star. Okay. There's a couple points I want to make about it before we move on. So the first point is, this was actually raised by a student after class last, I think it was on Wednesday. And the question is, if suppliers know that QM is too much, if they know that this is overall, this quantity QM is overall producing a worse outcome for society than if they could cut back to Q star, why don't they just reduce their production to Q star? That's a great question. You can think of it as follows. The units between Q star and QM are opportunities for suppliers to engage in mutually beneficial exchanges with consumers. The way that I know that is that consumers are willing to pay a level up here at this black line, according to the demand curve. Consumers are willing to pay up to that much for those units, and suppliers are perfectly willing to sell for anything that's above their private costs, which is this, again, given by this marginal cost curve. So the fact that there's a gap there means that there's opportunities for mutual gain, mutual benefit for producers and consumers. Both would be better off by being able to trade and obtain the gains from being able to produce and consume those units. Now, this is kind of a picture of the market as a whole. So there's a lot of different sellers, a lot of different producers. Any individual producer is going to represent a very small sliver of the market. You know, so if any individual producer, maybe they look around and they say, look, this good that we're producing, there's some social costs associated with it. There's some external damages. Let's do our part and try to cut back. You know, if any individual supplier decides to cut back, you know, you might end up with, you know, you start here and you might end up with one supplier cutting back. You might end up just with like almost an imperceptible shift to the left. Like you might the quantity is gonna shift to the left, but it's gonna be just a hair's breadth. It's not even gonna almost register at all in terms of the overall production. So the individual supplier in that case is foregoing beneficial opportunities to make some money, to grow their business, or to increase their income, to provide for their families. They're missing out on some opportunities to do that, and it's only having a very tiny effect on the total quantity, because everybody else, all their competitors, might just decide that it's fine to produce at whatever level they want to. So the costs to cutting back on that production for an individual supplier are enormous. You reduce your own business income, and the total effect on the quantity is almost imperceptible. So it's almost like we have this social dilemma. Like, so back in the first couple periods of the semester, the first couple classes, one of the themes was we have these social dilemmas where it's uh, it's beneficial for you personally to use a resource, or to take some action, but those effects have or those actions have effects on other people, but no individual has an incentive to actually change their behavior. It's the same idea here. So if, like, I think the example we used in class, maybe on the second day of class, was like a groundwater aquifer, which if you decide that you want to conserve the water in that aquifer and reduce your pumping, reduce the scale of your pumping, you don't get to use that water for whatever beneficial activity you wanted to use it for. You don't get to irrigate your crops, or you don't get to use that water for drinking, or for other kinds of production. And if you conserve that water, if you don't pump it today, your neighbors might just very well pump it, in which case you don't get water today, and you don't get water the next year either, because your neighbors have already pumped that water that you had decided to save. It's exactly the same principle here, where individual suppliers might feel on principle that it would be better for them to produce less because of the external effects, but doing so reduces their own income and only has a tiny effect on the total quantity, and their competitors are just going to continue to do whatever they're going to do. And so you need to have some kind of agreement, or some kind of ability to coordinate the activities between people in order for that dilemma to get resolved. It's really it's a social dilemma, where the incentives of the individual don't align with the incentives of society as a whole. Okay, so that's kind of one point I wanted to make uh, related to this graph here. Point number 2 that I wanted to make is the fact that even after we have curtailed our production from QM to Q star, we're still left with a little bit of external costs. We're left with external costs equal to B, which is lower than what they were before. Before, they were B plus E plus F. But we've sort of we've reduced them to a more tolerable level. So this gets to the idea of the idea that we talked about a little bit in the microeconomics section, where we talked about the efficient level of pollution, how there's still some level of pollution which, if we were going to reduce it down to zero, it would be very costly. It would be prohibitively costly, and the gains associated with reducing it down to zero would be very small. We would gain something, but it would be we're not solving serious problems. If you remember from our sulfur dioxide example, the gains of reducing pollution initially were that we prevent people from having severe respiratory illness, and then we start reducing eye and throat irritation, and then eventually we start to improve visibility, and we start to improve the exterior of buildings. They start to not corrode as often. So the benefits start to get a little bit less and less important. The costs get increasingly expensive, and at a certain point, we decide it's not really worth our while to continue to reduce pollution to such a small level that it doesn't benefit us that much anymore. So there's this idea of the efficient level of pollution, which still has some external costs which persist after that, but we've reduced them to something that we're more willing to tolerate as a society. And specifically, we reduce them to, to whatever is going to persist after marginal benefit equals social marginal costs. The efficient level Q star occurs where the marginal benefits of that pollution equal the social marginal cost. That's exactly the same principle that we had applied in that discussion of efficiency in the microeconomics section of the course. So that's just a simple point I wanted to make, which is that there's not an elimination of the externality. There's just a reduction in the scope of the externality. The externality is reduced to a level that we prefer. We prefer that smaller level to the higher level that we were dealing with before. Okay. This graph here shows up here on the upper left-hand corner. I have the graph of marginal external costs, which, like I said before, we add those on top of the private marginal costs to get the social marginal costs, right? And I'll just also mention too that the social marginal costs, where the social marginal cost curve intersects the marginal benefits, that's the quantity that we should be shooting for. In theory, that's in principle, that's the quantity that we would like to produce where the marginal benefits equal to the social marginal cost. MB equals SMC, if you can read that, is where you want to produce Q star. So if we're adding this marginal external cost up onto the private marginal cost, there's different ways that will look after we do that. So if the marginal external cost has a upward slope, maybe it starts at 0 and it kind of slopes up, then our social marginal cost is going to start at the same intercept as the private marginal cost, and then it's going to increase at an increasing rate, kind of with the same kind of trajectory as the marginal external cost. So the shape of the social marginal cost is going to be affected by the shape of the marginal external cost. So if it's flat, it's going to be a parallel shift up. If it's a kind of something that starts at 0 and that has a constant upward slope, the social marginal cost will kind of follow that same pattern. If instead it's kind of starts at 0 and then it increases at kind of an increasing rate, then the social marginal cost curve will also follow that same pattern. Remember, it's merely the horizontal, or sorry, it's merely the vertical sum of the marginal external cost and the private marginal cost. All right, so remember that Q star is what we're aiming for here. One way that we can try to achieve that is by slapping some kind of fine or some kind of extra penalty on that activity, which we call that a Pigouvian tax. Arthur Pigou wrote a book around the turn of the 20th century, back in the late 1800s, early 1900s. He wrote a book called The Economics of Welfare, where he talked about problems that have social costs associated with them. And his solution was to impose an extra penalty or an extra tax on the good that was being produced. And so what this does is, for every unit that's being produced, the suppliers have to pay an extra fine or pay an extra penalty for each unit that they produce. So this will be something that makes producers think twice about about whether they really need to produce that thing or not. So maybe it's especially valuable to them to produce it, but maybe the fine or the tax will incentivize them to cut back a little bit. But regardless of exactly how they want to cut back, they have flexibility. So one of the key features of a Pigouvian tax is it gives the producer flexibility over how they want to produce. Um, it gives them both flexibility in terms of the amount of reduction that they want to make, and it gives them flexibility over how they want to achieve that reduction. Some businesses, it might be very costly to them to reduce pollution, and they might decide it's better for me to pay the tax than to reduce by a huge amount. Other businesses might have very inexpensive means to reduce their pollution, in which case they will want to perhaps cut back by quite a bit in order to avoid the extra penalty that they face for paying the tax. But wherever you fall along that spectrum, whether it's easy or difficult for you to reduce your pollution, the tax gives maximum choice and maximum flexibility to producers to be able to decide for themselves how much is sort of economical for them to pollute. And then if the tax is imposed and not enough pollution is reduced, maybe you realize that the tax wasn't high enough, you might be able to adjust the tax upward a little bit more to get more and more people to cut back. And you can sort of, in theory, you could sort of adjust the tax sequentially in order to get the level of pollution that you want. So it's a way to achieve the efficient level without having to dictate to individual suppliers exactly how much they pollute and exactly how they make those reductions. It's also a way for the government to raise some revenue. That's not the primary focus of a Pigouvian tax is to shift incentives and change behavior. But another potentially beneficial byproduct of it is that it could allow you to raise revenue and then perhaps reduce other taxes in the economy, such as the income tax, raising revenue through the Pigouvian tax, reducing the income tax, and actually giving more people an incentive to work and letting them keep more of their money for themselves, which makes people overall better off. So at the same time as you're increasing one tax, you could reduce the size of a different tax and have it be kind of increasing overall efficiency in the economy. So remember that taxes end up reducing the equilibrium quantity. So that's the goal of a Pigouvian tax. When you slap this tax on, it's as if the producers have a higher marginal cost than before, and so they have to, in addition to their labor costs and their energy costs, their materials costs, they have this extra tax cost, which makes production a little bit more costly for them, and so their cost curve, in a sense, shifts up. And under this new tax regime, under this new marginal cost structure, every supplier is going to be facing that new tax, and so they all kind of are able to coordinate their behavior a little bit better, and they all will make slight reductions. And not any single producer is responsible for the entire quantity reduction, but each supplier chips in a little bit and reduces their quantity, and the aggregate sum of all those individual actions is that the total quantity reduces from QM to a lower quantity QT. Now remember that we wanted a quantity here that was where the social marginal cost equal to the marginal benefit. So that's kind of our target. Our target is Q star. Right now we're at QM, but we want to be at Q star. And so one way that we can do that is by choosing some kind of tax that will lead us to Q star. So for example, if we decide to put a tax on this good equal to this amount here, where this purple line is here. So this would be MC plus tax. If we set the level of the tax right there, we end up with a quantity somewhere right here. This will be where the new quantity is produced. In that case, that would be too low, or the tax would be too low. We would not be achieving quite the level of reduction we wanted to. That would be a quantity that would still be a little bit higher than Q star. So we could think about maybe adjusting the tax to a different level. We could set the tax instead at maybe something like this. If we were worried that the tax was too low before, we could adjust the tax like that, and change the incentives of suppliers again by a little bit of an amount. That would result in a new equilibrium quantity that was right here. In that case, we have reduced the quantity by a little bit too much, at least relative to Q star. So the sweet spot is right where, if we can set the tax so that the new marginal cost curve for suppliers exactly intersects the demand curve right at the Q star that we want, that's the level of the tax that would take care of the externality, or reduce the quantity from an excessive amount to the socially optimal amount. And let me just point out that the level of that tax, specifically the level of that tax, is the height of this sort of bright green line right here. It's the height between the marginal benefit curve and the marginal cost curve, the private marginal cost curve at Q star. That's the height. And so the optimal tax, or the tax that would get you to Q star, is equal to whatever per unit tax, or however high that, whatever the vertical height of that line is, that's the per unit tax that will be enough to incentivize suppliers to cut back on their production enough to reach Q star rather than QM. So that'll come in handy on your homework assignment. You'll have to figure out what the tax is that you need to be able to shift the quantity to the efficient point. And it turns out that it's the height of that little bar there. It's the height between the marginal benefit curve and the private marginal cost curve at Q star. I just want to say one quick thing about upstream taxes and downstream taxes. So this is more of like an implementation question, and it's a question about efficiency, not so much like efficiency in an economic, it's not efficiency in the sense of trying to find the economically efficient level of pollution. It's efficiency in more of a administrative or bureaucratic sense. It's trying to ask the question of what's the way to implement the tax that would be less costly than a more cumbersome way. So essentially, an upstream tax is a lot more efficient than a downstream tax. So think of it like, let's say that the production of T-shirts, there's some T-shirts that have coloring in them, and they have toxic dyes in the T-shirt. One of the ways that you could correct that is to go around and figure out every single T-shirt that's being sold, and figure out exactly how much toxic dye there is in that shirt, and assess the tax on each individual shirt according to the amount of toxic dye that's in that shirt. That would be a very cumbersome way of figuring out the tax. That would be a downstream tax. That would be a downstream tax on final products. Instead, what you could do is you could assess the tax on the production of the dye itself. So you could go all the way to the source and assess the tax on the production of the exact chemical that is producing the external effects that you want to avoid. So you could tax the production of the dye itself. In that case, the cost to the producers go up, because you have you've slapped on an extra cost to the producers of that dye. You've given them a little extra cost by giving them a per unit tax on some production of that dye, and now their costs are higher, and so they are going to pass that tax along. They're going to eat some of it. They're going to have to incur some of it, but that price is going to get passed along. That higher price is going to get passed along to whoever they sell the dye to the next intermediate user of that dye, and that intermediate user of the dye is going to have to pay a little bit more for the dye. They're going to pass that along to the next purchaser of the dye. Maybe it's the t-shirt manufacturer at that point. They're going to pass that dye along. They're going to pass that extra cost along to the consumer. So if you assess the tax on the source, you sort of eliminate the need to go item by item and figure out how much toxic substance is in that product, and instead you just let people decide for themselves how much of that they want to buy according to the higher cost that they have to face, based on the fact that the supplier of the initial dye is having to pay an extra cost. So that's just upstream taxes are just more efficient because they don't require as much of an administrative burden relative to going item by item and figuring out how much to assess on each item. So we have, I mentioned this at the top of the hour, but we have this welfare analytic approach to externalities, which is associated with Pigou, which is the idea that we can try to measure these overall costs to society and slap a fine or a penalty or a tax on the activity that we don't want as much of. We want to reduce the amount of that activity. And then we can notice that after we've done that, quantity is reduced, and we can sort of tally up the gains to society as a whole as a result of putting that fine on the product, or the tax on the product. An alternative perspective is the one that's given by Ronald Coase, which is that it's not obvious that the government is going to know all of the individual activities in the economy that are having harmful effects on other people. If we think about that example of the wheat farmer and the cattle rancher, which Coase used in his article, it would be very difficult for the government, it'd be very difficult for like the Department of Agriculture to go around and figure out how many crops are being trampled by stray cattle. That's a problem that is much better solved by the people that are directly involved in it. The cattle rancher and the wheat farmer are going to have a much better idea of how much of a problem there is of straying cattle. They're going to have a much better idea of that than a bureaucrat in Washington D.C. is, and they're going to have a lot more of an idea of like what the solutions are to that problem. And so one of the things that Coase noticed is that if you let people, if you give people well-defined property rights, and if you kind of specify in advance very, very specifically what the liability situation is, then allowing people to make mutually beneficial transactions among each other is going to be a much more efficient way of dealing with these social problems than having the government try to decide how much of a tax should be imposed on this or that activity. And in fact, if the bargaining costs are low, or if the transaction costs are low, then the parties that are involved in the activity, both the party that's undertaking the harmful activity and the party that's being harmed by it, both of those parties are going to have a much better idea of what the actual costs are and what the measures are to reduce those costs. They're going to have a much better idea of what to do about that situation than the government is. So Coase's insight was, first of all, that externalities are reciprocal, that they require both somebody undertaking an activity as well as somebody who's on the receiving end of an activity. And then the second point is that allowing them to bargain and having them bargain if they're able to have low enough negotiating costs and they're able to communicate with each other and reach some kind of mutually beneficial bargain, that's going to have a much better outcome than leaving it up to some kind of tax regime which slaps a tax on the activity in question. Okay, so that's kind of the Coase theorem, sort of as it's stated in the book, is that if property rights are well defined and transactions costs are low, an efficient allocation of resources is going to emerge from that process. One problem is that the distribution of the gains to different parties is going to be affected by who gets the rights. So who gets the rights initially won't affect the solution that they arrive at, that the two parties can agree on, but it will affect who gets to benefit more. It will affect who has to pay more in order to arrive at that efficient solution. So the one party is going to prefer one property rights regime, the other party is going to prefer a different property rights regime, and the distribution of the gains will be affected by who gets those rights. I want to sort of conclude class today with an example and kind of an exercise for you to work on, which kind of brings together some of the welfare analysis that we did before, as well as this Coasian bargaining idea. So let's say we have an example here of a company that is discharging some pollution into the water source that's used by a particular community. So we have a marginal cost curve here, which represents the pollution costs to the community, and so those increase as more and more pollution is discharged from the company. At the same time, the discharge of that pollution gives the company some kind of benefit, and if they wanted to reduce that pollution, they would have to pay some cost to do so. So the company's marginal benefits of pollution are given by this marginal benefit curve that slopes downward here. The marginal costs to the community are given by this curve here. And I want you to think about what would be the payoffs to each of these firms, or the firm and the community. What would be the payoffs to them of having the property rights be in one corner versus the other? So this is going to be your second in-class assignment. Let's consider first whether the company has the rights to pollute. If they have the rights to pollute, they're going to pollute up to 80 tons, and the community is going to have to bargain them down to a lower level. And I want you to consider, what would the community be willing to pay to reduce from 80 to 50, and what would the company be willing to accept? And just give me the geometrically what those areas are. Just give me your answer in terms of A, B, C, D, E, and F. First, consider the situation where the company has the right to pollute up to 80. Then consider the scenario where the community has the rights to zero pollution, and any pollution that the company does, they have to pay the community to be able to do that. In that case, what would the company be willing to pay to pollute up to 50 tons? And what would the community be willing to accept to be able to tolerate 50 tons of pollution? I will have a little bit of material to wrap up with on Monday on this externalities section, but I'm planning on starting the section on common property resources and public goods next time we meet. So if there are no questions, you're free to stick around if you do have questions, but if not, have a nice weekend, and we'll pick up on Monday with some common property resources and public goods stuff.